Welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for having a chat to me. Where are you phoning in from?
I'm phoning from Sydney, where I live with my family. And yeah, I'm really delighted to be on your podcast. Thanks, Matthew.
Fantastic. It's lovely to get to have a conversation with you. And as we were saying before I hit record, the thing that I love about this podcast is that I get to have conversations with people that I find really interesting. I'm constantly reading, and your work at the Achievement Addiction really stood out to me. So I'm really grateful to get to unpack some of those things that you talked about. Quite possibly the most important question, Justine, what's your coffee order?
I don't drink coffee. I'm more of a tea person, but I will very happily have a mocha. I don't think that's quite legit, but I will do that.
And are you a loose leaf tea person or a tea
No,
bag?
no, tea bag. I like sweet teas. I think I've got quite a sweet tooth. So if it's something like a peppermint and licorice tea, then I think, especially during Lent, when I sometimes give up something, if I give up sugar, I still will allow myself a sweet tea. So I might be bending the rules slightly.
Justine, you mentioned that you're a mum. I know you've got a very busy life, a lot of things going on. How do you define success? And has that changed since becoming a parent? Because for me, being a parent has fundamentally changed me at my core in ways that I never thought possible. Can you relate to that?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I wasn't someone who needed to be a parent, if I can put it
Yeah,
in
yeah.
those terms. I don't know whether this is a result of my family upbringing, but I was always very invested in what I would do work-wise and career
Mm,
and that sort of thing. And I wanted to be married, and I suppose I wanted to have a family, but only in a very generic sense. I never
got
really
it.
thought too much about it. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about my own family background when it comes to achievement addiction. But I suppose that has something to do with it. But sorry, I suppose that my family background has something to do with how I viewed success. But even like now as a parent, I think I'm still working out what it means to be successful, and not just as a parent, but as a human,
Yeah.
really. I feel like I can still get tripped up sometimes, meaning I'm still addicted in some ways to achievement. I can still get tripped up on thinking that success means hitting a particular goal and doing it in a particular way. You might notice that in this book, I don't actually mention perfectionism
Yeah.
once. I think
Yeah.
that's probably a blind spot of the book, and I might be still grinding along on that perfectionist journey every now and then. So I think what success looks like for me now is to have a more well-rounded understanding of what it means to be fully human, and that's not
Mhm.
just leaning into one kind of side of myself, which is, I suppose, driven to understand and to try and work things out, but also to be able to you know rest and enjoy the outside world without just my to-do list ticking over
Yeah.
in my head going, what am I
Yeah.
not doing right now? Because I
Yeah.
I should be doing that rather than being
Yeah.
out and enjoying myself, right? So
Yeah.
something like, I think if I was
It's
to be
great.
able to really embrace a practice of rest that is informed by that Sabbath understanding, right? Like, and it
Mhm.
doesn't mean a nap on the Sunday afternoon, but it means like this is what all the work is for. Do you know what
Totally.
I mean? Like it's supposed
Oh,
to, yeah, like it's supposed to
absolutely.
cap the week rather than I shouldn't have to think that work defines the limits of my existence, right?
I mean, Justine, there's so many follow-up questions in those points that you raised. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Oliver Burkeman, a phenomenal book, and I had the absolute privilege of interviewing him a little while
Oh,
ago.
wonderful. Yeah.
And there was this, and he was wonderful, and I did not think when I reached out he would get back to me. It's not a reflection of him, more of me. And I said, look, I've read your book, and it really has changed my life. And I think he has this
Hmm.
phrase in there, and he was warm and wonderful and kind and just incredibly generous. And he has this phrase in there, and he talks about the insecure overachiever. And I read that, and I thought, wow, like, I mean, that's me. I mean, I love achievement. I love professional learning. I love doing all this stuff, that all these sort of markers of success. But it really made me stop and go, what is it that's actually sort of driving this?
Yeah.
And it was that phrase that just stood out, and I went, my goodness. And it really did make me sort of stop and think, because if we're honest, I have a huge privilege of being part of a leadership team of just the most incredible school. If I'm honest, I'm not really doing it for my kids. I'm not really going to work each day I mean, providing for my kids is great, but if I'm honest, I kind of like doing it because it's a good feeling of feeling important, isn't it? Like it's nice to go to work and feel like people want you and need you. It's nice to be the person that people go to ask questions and you solve their problems. But the quote and the work of Oliver Burkeman really made me stop and go, what is it that's really driving that? And am I really doing it, if I'm honest, for other people? Or is there a small part of me that actually enjoys feeling wanted and needed? And it sounds a bit pathetic when you say it, but it's
Well, I don't know, Matthew. I think there's so many layers to what you just said
yeah,
just now. Like
yeah,
I completely agree that for me there is a piece of the insecure achiever or insecure high achiever or
yeah,
overachiever or whatever it
overachiever,
is,
yeah.
achiever, like going yeah, that is certainly a part of my story. But I also think that there is something about work that is deeply satisfying to us as
Absolutely.
humans, right?
Yeah,
So it's not simply an ego trip that this is why you're in your job, right? You know, it's not just, maybe 60% providing for your family and then 40% ego trip. That's right. There needs to be another percentage in there. And, if we can express it in those terms
mm,
of being like, there is something that makes us really fully alive when we are doing
yeah,
work that resonates with our passions and our deep convictions, all right, about the world. And so I really want to be able to make a case for that as
mm,
well. It's just that the insecure overachiever part is just that can sometimes be, well, it can be a driver, as in my case. It can also crowd out the other reasons that you want to be
mm,
there. But I also think part of the mystery of being human is that the thing that you really love can also be a real source of weakness, unfortunately.
yeah,
And us learning how to live in that vulnerability of that strange, complex mix and being aware enough and honest enough, my gosh, about when it's getting out of hand and then
yeah,
trying to take steps to sort of to just calibrate to that so we can try and get ourselves back on a
yeah,
better path. I think that's wisdom. Actually, I want to
absolutely.
modify my answer to what is success. Success is wisdom. It's
Yeah.
not just the smarts. It's not just like acing the test. It's knowing what to do, when to do, and how to do it well.
Yeah.
You know?
My wonderful wife has taught me so much, and part of it is when she asks the question, she says, sort of, what percentage of this decision is like ego driven? And if
Mm.
we're honest, every decision you make has an element of ego.
Yeah.
It's just when that starts to, at what point is that encroaching into dangerous territory?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether it be, I don't know, purchasing a new car because you think it makes you look cool, or purchasing an overpriced shirt because, I don't know, you think
Same
it looks
thing.
nice. Exactly. And I think for me, that's been really helpful, just stopping and going, okay, there's ego somewhere in here, but
Mm.
what sort of percentage are we talking about? And it's
Yeah.
obviously up to each individual what percentage is and what isn't. There's so much in that, Justine, and I think your book really made me stop and think and go, okay. I laughed out loud, and I'd love you to maybe to talk about your background and where you think some of this achievement addiction comes from. I loved the chapter that says everyone is kind of Asian now, and I'd love you to maybe. I didn't know if I
Oh,
was allowed to laugh at that, but I did.
yeah.
What did you mean by that? And yeah, tell us a little bit about your background.
So I think at the time when I wrote Achievement Addiction, about 10 years earlier, that's when this concept of the tiger mother
Yeah.
had come roaring, so to speak, onto the scene. Where Amy Chua, she's this like law professor, she wrote a book about the famously harsh parenting styles of Asians who
Yeah.
demand kind of high achievement and accomplishment. And she told all these over-the-top stories about, she would get hand-drawn Christmas cards from her children, but then she would send them back because they weren't good enough, sort of thing. So I think she was playing up the laughs, and I mean, in some ways it worked for her because she has
Yeah.
created this idea of the tiger mum. But I suppose well, I wouldn't say every, but many children of Asian immigrants, I should say. I mean, I think it's worse actually if you happen to be in an Asian country. But in terms of Asian immigrants to other countries like Australia, in my case, there is still this emphasis upon you got to do really well. You have to learn a musical instrument. You have to become the first in your class. So, and in my parents' mind as well, the selective high schooling system in Sydney was going to be our route to a quote unquote good education. And so my older sister, she's 2 years older
Mm,
than me, she managed to get into Sydney Girls High School. So I
right.
felt the pressure of doing that exam and I didn't make it in, right? And then from that point, it was like my life was over. I'm not kidding. Like I just had this constant fear over my head of, well, maybe I did well in this particular exam, or maybe I came second in class, but my parents would be like, well, who came first? And then I would say to myself, look, you've gotten a really decent mark on this exam, but this is a public comprehensive school. So if you were in a selective school, you would just be like, very, very average. So it's just not good enough. So you can see how this sort of self-talk over the course of a high school career can really drill down deep into someone like myself. This
Mm.
idea that, you're only as good as your worth, really, and that worth in that world is measured purely in how many times can I come first in class, what, like
Yeah. Wow.
yeah, I need to be the best in all these things. I was, however, quite lucky because I really loved the work at the same time.
Yeah. Great.
So I'm glad that that managed to elbow its way in as well. So it wasn't purely a studying to the test situation. But I tell you, I peaked in terms of my work ethic when I was studying for the HSC because in a weekend, I would time myself and do like past HSC papers for my modern history, my ancient history, my English kind of assessments. And in some ways, I look back on it now and I could have walked into that exam and they could have thrown any question at me and I could have done it because I practiced and drilled myself so hard because I felt like everything was riding on this. And that's
Right.
not a healthy way to be. It's just not.
And I think
So,
it would come from I would imagine, like I migrated to Australia, but I can't relate to that high expectation from my parents in the way that you've described. But that would be coming from a good place, though, wouldn't it? Like your parents
yeah,
wanting you to succeed and to be able to provide for yourself and to many ways stand on their shoulders. But yeah,
yeah,
that's
no,
challenging, isn't
absolutely. I think one thing that was surprisingly healing during the writing of Achievement Addiction is that I engaged with the work of Justine Toh. She's a
it?
education professor at University of Technology, Sydney. And she talked about how the kind of new immigrant to the country lacks social networks, perhaps, and also may not be aware or fluent in the kind of unspoken norms, right? That might allow them to give their child a head up in like a leg up in life.
Yeah, yeah,
And so, in some ways, but if they're, especially if they're Asians and they're coming from an educational system in Asia, in Hong Kong, in China, Korea, which is incredibly competitive, then the Asian immigrant, what do they have on their side? They have that furious work ethic and they know how to drill their kids and really invest in their education, whether that's doing homework with them or sending them to tuition schools. And so the
interesting.
reason I say that everyone's kind of Asian now is that look, it's not as though I'm calling people racist,
No,
but I'm
no,
aware and I can pick up kind of slightly racist or racist adjacent sort of tones,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so I can see, and I can just see just by picking up and just by quietly observing and hearing people speak that there is this sort of tone that, Asians are a little bit like a bit so hardcore about education that it's almost like I don't know how to quite articulate
Mm.
it, but it's there's a sense of, oh, we don't do that to our children, like that's not a proper education. We like them to play sport. I
Yeah,
don't want them to go to a selective school because there would not be any diversity there. There are these kinds of statements, right, which are
interesting.
quite racially coded if you read between the lines. Anyway, I needed to sort of, if I was going to bring up the tiger parenting angle of my book, I needed to be able to not give people permission to just simply like, oh yeah, now I can joke about Asian things now. So
It's interesting.
by me saying actually a lot of parents and a lot of authority figures in our lives function like tiger parents as well. It was my
Yeah,
way of saying,
I
well,
love
the
that.
tiger parent is not an exclusively Asian thing, not an
Yeah.
exclusively immigrant thing. And also, I think at the time there were these stories about these gym coaches, which is a very quote unquote, well, no, I won't go there. I won't make my own racial comedy moment or racial blunder. But there were these gymnastics coaches who were really like hardcore and really ruthless when it came to drilling the kids. And like parents at sometimes weekend sport, right? With when their kids are playing, they can sometimes like lose it on the sidelines as well. And that's an Asian kind of parent moment,
Interesting.
even if
Yeah.
it's not Asians. Yeah, so I needed to sort of say that everyone is kind of Asian now to be able to firstly identify the fact that you can find tiger parenting
Mm,
like characteristics in
yeah.
a whole set of parents, but also we're a part of this work culture as well where you do feel like you've got to go out there and fight for your life, and who are you if you don't have a job, and if you like, this is where societally speaking we have decided that you find your worth by where you live in a place like
True.
Australia
True.
where that
What
that that
suburb you're in?
suburb you're in tells us exactly what income bracket you're in as well, right?
Yeah.
So you have to do that because of the housing market. You have to stay relevant. You have to make sure that you're competitive. And so in some ways, everyone out there who can identify with even a small part of that, that's basically how I felt going through high school, right? So if that was the product of being tiger parented, we have all been, I guess, societally tiger
Mm,
parented in order to, like,
mm.
and this has made us adopt those characteristics, even if we
Yeah.
don't happen to be Asian
It's
ourselves.
it's it's so interesting. And Justine, what are as a parent, what are some of the things that respectfully to your parents that you are happy to take into your own children's future? And what are some of those things that you are happy to leave behind? I mean, how do
Oh,
you kind of navigate
well.
anyways these two worlds?
I think what I'm happy to leave behind is that sort of language around, who came first? If it wasn't you, what happened?
Yeah,
Sort
yeah.
of thing.
Great point.
But but I also think that they were really wonderful in like being so committed to us and our
Mm,
education. And that was their love language of making sure that we
yeah,
were going to be able to be set up for the long
yeah,
term. Yeah, so I think that is really powerful and it has its place. And so I don't regret that at all.
yeah.
The trick for me is how not to be like a tiger parent myself. I know that sounds like
I feel
ironic
it.
in a
My
way.
my kids are quote unquote in the system now, and I find myself being on the receiving end
Yeah.
of information from schools, but also pushing it out to parents in my school community. So it's been really interesting to go, okay, like how do I like navigate this space? I mean, we even had an incident today. My lovely daughter, and she's in year one, and I have to remind myself she's in year one.
Yeah.
It's gonna be, and she's very nervous about playing her ukulele and practicing, and to be honest, probably needed to have rehearsed a few more times. And so she went on stage today. She carried up a ukulele and she was meant to be playing with a group of other students, and she just burst into tears and
Oh, the poor
needed a hug
thing.
from mum. And I thought, okay,
Yeah.
how as a parent, how do I navigate this? And we just went out for dinner today and we thought, okay, we're actually going to celebrate effort and bravery here. And so I said, I held her little face and I said, I'm so proud of you for trying and for being so brave.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to make that into a teachable moment to say, you know what, you need to do this, you need to do that. But
Mm.
I think celebrating effort is actually quite important and celebrating
Yeah.
resilience because she's in year one. It's going to be okay.
Mm.
But
No, that's
you
right.
find yourself getting caught up into that in that, don't you? And friends at barbecues, it's like, what's your kid doing now? What level's she reading? There's this whole, it's like, hang on a second. But I'm sure you can relate to that in some way as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's probably easier for me just to tr even if I just, just say one of my children does something really well, I need to learn how to just not necessarily talk about it. Because in some ways it doesn't
Because you're
really,
proud though. Yeah.
I'm proud and I want to be able to accept that, but then I can just sometimes, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not as though I'm afraid to praise my children, right?
Yeah.
When they've done something well. But I think when it comes to talking to other people outside of it, I think that's
Mm.
where I need an Aziza to come and say, how much percentage here is ego?
It's so
Type
hard though,
thing.
isn't it? Because like I mean, it's really difficult. And I struggle with this. Like, I mean, I see my dad with my daughters, and so obviously his granddaughters, and he's this wonderful, warm, engaging person. In my head, I'm like, where was that guy when I was growing up? Like, where was he? And and part of me, and this is not a reflection of him, but part of me is like, has just the notion of parenting changed? Because I don't remember at any point my parents coming home and talking to me about being a good citizen and talking about like resilience and perseverance. It was just they did their thing. I went and did my homework and I went to bed. And
Mm,
arguably, maybe that's why so many people my age are currently in therapy. But I don't know. I don't know if the sort of the notion of what it is to be an active member of society or a present parent, if that's just completely changed, because it is. Has it always been this hard to get it right? It's
yeah. I mean, there's so many things I could say. I'll try and be brief, but like
yeah.
I've heard grandparents say that it's a second chance to get some things right. So obviously, with after if enough time has passed, people can reflect on their behavior and they can decide if I had
Yeah.
another opportunity, I would do it differently. So that's one thing. Definitely, parenting norms have changed. We're very much into like, each child is a unique individual, which of course they are. And my job is to just offer you the world and give you whatever I can and make sure you have every opportunity to develop every talent you ever might possibly had. This is called intensive parenting. I guess helicopter parenting is a variety of that as
Living
well.
vicariously through your children because you didn't.
Well, it's also, I
Okay.
mean, it is underwritten by a degree of economic
Yeah.
anxiety in terms
That's
of
true.
they need to be able to navigate and be disciplined and efficient and all the rest of that. And what better way to inculcate that in young people than sending them to lots of after school activities?
Mhm.
So if they're if they're, out all day at school and then maybe they're not coming home till 5 or 6 o'clock, that's preparing them for life in a capitalist society, right? A nine to
Yeah.
five sort of existence. So there's that as well. But also, I think maybe in our dad's generation, there was not necessarily a stress and emphasis upon that kind of present dadhood, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
I think it is really fascinating that that palliative care nurse who wrote a book a couple of
Yeah.
years ago called The Top Five Regrets of the Dying.
Ronnie Ware. Yeah.
Yeah, that's her. And
Amazing.
she said, yeah, incredible stuff. And I think this is what we all want, right? I mean, getting back to the earlier question of what is success, it's getting to the end of your life and not having any of these regrets that she is that she talks about, the top five regrets of the dying. And number two was that I of well, number two was the regret, I wish I hadn't worked so much. And she said that it was mostly older men. Every older man that she nursed who, and as they lay dying, said this. And so,
Interesting.
that whole homemaker, breadwinner, or, was maybe a part-time working mother, let's say, and a
Yeah.
full-time breadwinning dad, that was probably more the conventional setup at our parents' generation. And
Interesting.
so we put a premium on men doing the financial provision, but not so much the emotional provision.
Yeah.
So how wonderful now that I think a generation later, we're able and we have more freedom than maybe your dad had, right? To be able
Mm.
to lean into that side of him. Because
Yeah.
like, yeah, I think
Interesting.
it's a hard thing to go out into the world and feel that responsibility that everything is actually riding on my shoulders. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't think that
Yeah.
if a guy's out working full time that he can't come home and, like do some vacuuming and all the rest of that. He absolutely has to do that as well and negotiate with his partner how that's going to happen equitably. I think that's really important. But
Yeah.
at the same time, there is something to be said for we've asked men to sacrifice in this way and we haven't allowed them to develop that
There's
kind of
there's
part of
so
themselves.
yeah, there's so much in that, isn't there? I think I mean it's really difficult because I know that you can't have it all though, can you? I mean that's the thing, and one of the things and to go back to the amazing work of Oliver Burkeman again, one of the things that I was talking about with him was that a yes to something is a no to 50 other things.
Yeah.
And so by now you're very graciously saying yes to having a conversation with me at 8:30 in the middle of the week at the end of the year. But that also means saying no to so many other things. Like it means saying no to you relaxing or you watching Netflix or you spending time with your kids or you doing whatever you need to do. But I think sometimes we forget that like we can't do everything. So
Mm.
why are we trying to do that? Because there will
Well,
inevitably be more things to do.
oh, that's right.
Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
really
I
difficult.
think part of the strangeness of being human is that we're so frail, right? We have those 4,000 weeks, as Oliver
Oh,
Berkman puts it, which I
terrifying,
think is, well, it's terrifying, but at the same
liberating.
time, it's almost like I feel like it's a Gandalf moment, right? Like all we
Mm,
have to do is to decide what to do with the time that has been given to us. And like I think about that a lot because right now, if I had acres of endless time, I wouldn't do anything in a
totally.
way. Like
Yeah,
I'm trying to get to a point where a deadline is my friend, like a friend that's my frenemy. I hate them, but they're my friend because it allows me to accept my mortality, right?
mm.
And I mean, I've just started, funnily enough, Oliver Berkman's book, so I haven't got to the end of it. But
It gets
um,
better. It gets
oh no,
better, Justine.
I'm 100% like
Oh,
convinced. But I think
yeah,
what he's done beautifully is capture that mortality
yeah,
piece
it
of the
does.
human person. But then at the same time, I'm not sure whether he goes there, but we do have like a longing for the infinite, right, in us
Yeah,
as well. And
yeah,
I think whenever everyone's had that experience where you're sitting around with a bunch of people that you love or you really are enriched by them and you're pretty sure that you enrich their lives as well. And just that moment when you've been having a wonderful conversation, maybe there's been a really nice meal and some wine. And then, you've had so much fun, but then everyone falls silent in that. There's always a moment
yeah,
where
yeah. There is. Yeah,
suddenly there's a slight lull. And that thing, like sometimes I'm in my inner narrative is going, oh, it's awkward. I don't like awkward silence. But I think if I listened a bit more deeper at that moment, what you're hearing is that why can't this go on forever?
totally.
This is a moment of eternity, I suppose,
Yeah,
suspended in time. And like that might sound a little bit strange, but for me as a Christian, I think that the Christian story makes sense of those
Yeah.
two very strange, conflicting experiences of being human, that we're deeply mortal and frail and broken and vulnerable. And
Yeah.
yet we have a longing to be more than ourselves. And
Yeah.
we feel that fullness in the room in that dinner party conversation. And we're like,
Yeah.
this is a moment that if we could stretch it out forever would be perfect.
Yeah, and there's a notion as well, and I think, sorry, the finiteness of life is the thing that makes it so special, and there's a concept called the last time,
Mm.
which is a really beautiful concept, and there is a last time that I will hug my daughters and carry them to bed.
Yeah.
Because when they're 35, you don't do that. But we just don't quite know when that last time is.
Yeah.
And I think
Mm.
this whole notion of everything in many ways is a last time. And so I think it just made me stop and hug those that I loved a little bit tighter and also realize kind of what's important. But just like you say in your book, I am a recovering achievement addict. And I find myself slipping back into those at various points of the week, usually a Thursday or a Friday when I haven't done any of the things
Mm.
that I wanted to, and especially at the end of the term. But do
Yeah.
you find yourself kind of falling back into that? Is it a
Oh, all the
constant
time. All the
battle for
time.
you? You're not through it?
Yeah. Well, I'm through it, but it's one of those like, this is probably the addict's journey as well in some ways. Like it's one step forward, two steps back sort of thing. And like, so for example, when I go to high schools and I speak to young people about this stuff, I'm always worried about, is my talk the way that I want it to be? And
Mm,
even though I kind of want to one day like throw the notes away because, do I really need them? I still am so stuck to my notes and I have a very kind of clear sense I want it to go like this. And this is the perfectionist in me coming out. I think it's interesting what you say about how Thursday and Friday and end of term can be kind of, you've identified these as sensitive spots times for you. I think it's because we're just depleted. And when you're depleted, you don't have the sort of resilience necessary, or you don't have that bandwidth to be able to kind
yeah.
of at least talk yourself into what you know to be true, right? But you
Mm,
can't quite embrace for yourself in your vulnerable moments. But I think what's really helpful in this case, and like, this is going to sound a bit strange, but I almost have to think, what would I say to one of my friends who I dearly
totally.
love in this moment if they were expressing this to me? And suddenly that becomes quite clear. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, yeah.
I think
We're always easier at giving other people advice, and the way that we talk in a dialogue is very different to the advice that we would say to a friend, I think.
yeah, but I think that the achievement addict part, like if you're an achievement addict, it's even harder to be kind to yourself because you're used to pinning your worth to your
Totally.
performance.
It,
So,
it is addictive, isn't it? Like, I mean, you
yeah.
mentioned that it's that achievement was kind of like your alcohol. Like, I
Gives you that
actually
buzz.
really
Yeah.
loved that. I wasn't expecting you to say that, but I loved it because it really does kind of anchor you, doesn't it? When you're
Mm.
feeling depleted or when you're feeling like you're not achieving what you need to. When you've got these little measures of success, it is
Yeah.
addictive.
Yeah,
Or
well, it's a
it's
self-soothing
sedative. Yeah,
situation, right? Like it helps it helps me be reassured that I'm okay. I
yeah,
can just take a deep breath now because I've got the thing that I needed to just help me over the line. So and for me to know that, okay, I might not be the most patient person in the world, which I definitely am not, but I'm really good at like getting things done. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, don't get me wrong, these are good things to have, but if
it's
I'm
that tension though, isn't it? It's those
it's a
carrying
tension,
things.
yeah. And if I'm constantly being driven by that insecure overachiever situation, which is always a possibility, then that's not good for me. That's not good
Yeah.
for my family. I mean, perfectionists can be really toxic when either the criticism that perfectionists direct at themselves gets sort of, sometimes it leaks out and it goes
Mm.
on other people. So there's that. But even if I'm so anxious to do a good job that I spend all my time doing this task, then I'm not spending that time with, the people I love and the people I really care about. Yeah.
Yeah. And Justine, just a bit of parenting advice. I find that transition from work to home really quite difficult because in many
Mm.
ways my job is very measured, it's very precise, it's very methodical. And then I came home today, as you heard the other day when you called to have a conversation. It is just absolute chaos. I came into our lounge room and I had a unicorn that was dressed in the corner. My kids were running around. my wife, God love her, was trying to get things organized for dinner. But it almost seems like there are two things happening here. Like I can tick off things at work, but at home, it's really difficult to measure that success because
Mm.
I don't know if it's working. I just don't know. Like it's hard.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I just think that because you're dealing with many people and
Yeah.
many people who, when they're tired and frazzled after the end of a long year, long term, whatever, they're
Yeah.
almost like mini drunk people. I mean,
Totally.
I say that with full affection, right? Like they just
They
don't have
are. Yeah.
full control over themselves
Yeah.
and everything is heightened in that state. But I just think it's a reminder, strangely, of the strange preciousness of the human, right? Like every other job, you have clear KPIs. There's usually probably an efficient process that you can like follow, tick, tick, tick. And if you've done your due diligence and you've applied yourself correctly, chances are you're going to be able to make it happen. But a person's not like that, right? Like they won't just slot into the convenient kind of spot that you want to have them in. And so, yeah, I think parenting made me confront for the first time, oh, wow, reason doesn't necessarily work in this situation. What am I supposed to do? And so learning the human arts of trying to negotiate and trying to work around and yes, perhaps bribe and coax and do all the things in order to try and get something happening. So, but the fluidity of that is chaotic and it's unpredictable and it's exhausting. But it's just a different kind of work. It's human work, right? Which I
Yeah.
think in the end is the
And it's the
most
most
satisfying
important.
of all.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think I'd sort of constantly remind myself that while I love my job, and while there are teachers listening to this all over the world that are committed 100% to the work that they do, if I wasn't there tomorrow, someone else would do it. No problem. There's a whole line of people probably waiting to do my job. They're competent. They're even more competent than I am. So I think sometimes there's this tension between going, yes, what I do is really important and what you do is really important, but I am completely replaceable at work, but I'm not at home. And it's difficult, isn't it, sometimes to go, okay, how do I navigate these tensions in my life? Because it's really hard. So it's these, like I said, holding that tension between, yes, what we're doing is vitally important, and there is a deep sense of calling and so on and so forth, but also it's not that important. I don't know. It's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a strange thing, isn't it? That the limits, which in our like in our modern world, we're sort of encouraged to think that you've got to be free of any limit that might impose itself upon you, right? So there
Yeah.
can only be obligations that you choose rather than you are obliged to someone else for reasons that you have not determined. And this is the thing with the achievement addict. Like you can just get high off of doing the thing that you set out to do and doing a really good job, but you're in control, right?
Totally.
Whereas if you are to, I don't want to say embrace limits because that sounds really naff and it's difficult. And, we want to, I'm always chafing against the limits, but I need to come to grips with them as well because they are actually, constraints aren't necessarily about preventing your fun. It can actually enable the fun to happen in the first place. Like if you think about it, the game of like basketball or soccer or whatever, there are rules and there are boundaries to the field of play. But that is actually what creates the game and
Mm.
creates and provides a space and a context for there to be fun and competition and
Yeah.
fulfillment. And so the limits in that case, I need to think more about how to acknowledge that these limits that I want to impose on my achievement addiction or my work ethic or whatever are actually designed to bring out the things that are really important that I really care about as well. Like you say, like you
Mm.
want to be there for your family, you want to be there for your friends, right? Like, I mean, they're really important to us as well.
Totally.
And if we're working all the time, we aren't able to, honor those commitments.
And I think Justine as well, I mean, that speaks as well to the work of Simon Sinek. Like he talks about like infinite and finite games. And I think
Mm.
the idea, like sort of understanding the difference. I mean, your family and things that are not as easy to measure are those infinite games. They just keep going. They keep going. Like I will never know the true impact of my time at home. I mean, you can have a shocking day, but you're not going to know if that's had a long-term impact or not. And I think the difficulty I find is that I can neglect things, and I really try not to. I try to be as present as I can when I come home, but I can neglect things each day and not really see the impact of that for years to come. And I think that's the
Mm.
thing that's particularly scary because you
Yeah.
don't know until. And one of the things we do with our girls, we don't have a TV in our house, and we haven't for probably 15 years or so. And that's been a game changer because we actually just sit down and have a conversation and we talk. And
Mm.
some of the questions we have with our girls each night are what went well today and also what didn't go well. And
Yeah.
my kids hated it at first. And do you know how hard it is to try and get a conversation out of a 3-year-old? But now it's just part of what we do. And
Mm.
I think we're starting to see that now after years and years of doing that, is that now we've got two little people that are able to express their emotions, that they are able to say how they feel. And I know that when they're 13 and 15, when those teenage hormones kick in, I know that that's going to be an investment that I really draw on, because you kind of want to be there in the things that are not a big deal, but they are a big deal. And I don't know, it's
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah,
But taking that long-term approach is really hard sometimes.
no, for sure.
Yeah.
But then I think is it in Hamilton? Yes, where there's a line, what is legacy? Legacy is planting seeds in a garden that you never get to see. I mean, hopefully we all get to see
Know
our
what you're saying.
children grow, right? But there is something to like gardening. I'm not a gardener person. I don't have time. That's a whole other conversation we could have about
Of
for that.
course.
Yeah, that's right. But there's something to the slow, patient tending, the weeding. Do you know what I mean? Like as soon as you clear the
Mm,
ground, something else grows back and then you've got to be back there. So it rewards presence, it rewards investment, but it is such slow work, which may be in some ways a clue to all the kinds of work that are very worthwhile in the end because human work is also slow and frequently unrewarding. And as soon as you maybe get progress, there's also like, oh, there's also that thing that really drives me nuts about that
yeah.
person. And I have to exercise even more patience in order to persevere with them. I may or may not be talking about children, but again, it's that labor of love over a lifetime. And like we have to give ourselves a bit of a break. We have bad days. Things happen that are
Totally.
completely out of our control. But I keep hearing that that moment of rupture, but also repair is like a
Yeah.
critical kind of like dynamic. And that is also, I think gardens can give you
Mm,
that leeway to be able to practice those kinds of
yeah.
cycles, right?
Well,
To
we've learned
both.
to, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off,
No,
but
no,
yeah.
no. I'd finished. Yeah,
Yeah.
go for it.
Well, we say sorry quickly,
Yeah.
really quickly. And my
Mm.
kids are far better at it than I am. I'm the stubborn one that says, no, I'm not ready to admit that you were wrong. And so like, but I think having that culture of saying sorry quickly has been really instrumental. And I do that with my
Yeah.
team. I said, hey guys, I'm hungry. Sorry, I shouldn't have, you know? So Justine, how do we take more of or how do we have a better relationship then with work and productivity? Because as we were saying before we hit record, it just seems to be getting busier and busier. We're at the end of the year again. I don't know what I did this year. It seems to be moving quicker and quicker. So, do you have
Mm.
thoughts on how we can have a bit of a better relationship with sort of work and productivity? Because it's not going away.
Yeah, and I'm aware that, a lot of teachers would be listening to this podcast, and I just really want to say that I think teachers give so much, right? They give more than 100%, like all the time.
Every
And
day.
and then at the end of the year, wow, that's why you have that long break. And honestly, it should be longer in order to recover. And I think teachers really care deeply about excellence. And, teachers are the expert gardeners among us doing that patient human work of tending, right? So what I feel is incredible about that is that that is excellence in action. Now, excellence is very different from achievement addiction because achievement
Absolutely.
addiction is often a feedback loop to the self. How did I do today? How can I put props on myself for hitting those goals? Whereas excellence means that the work is doing sorry, excellence means that the work is worth doing in its own right, or it's there to achieve human ends of flourishing.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that, especially for teachers, there's this writer, James Mumford, who, believe it
Mhm.
or not, is the brother of the Marcus Mumford of Mumford and Sons. But
Amazing. I
his
didn't know that. Amazing.
but his brother James is a British ethicist, and he wrote a beautiful ode to his teacher, who I believe she had passed away while in lockdown, or there was some link to COVID in that.
Wow.
And he basically said this ode to her, and he said this is true of the teaching profession in general. It's like it's almost like your job is to make more of your student, whereas you retreat into the background, right? So and you give that effort, you give of yourself daily, all the time to that person, to the cause of education, and you're being depleted at that point, but it also is strangely fulfilling as well because you can see the results of it, right? Now, again, this is how complex it is because all the things that I've just described is also a recipe for burnout. Do you know what I mean? So it's really, you've got to be really kind of careful how you weight those things and how you can try and work out, are we heading into burnout territory or am I still in my passion phase? Because we do want to be in that. I think there is something to there is something to be said for being in that part where there's that overlapping, if you think of a Venn diagram, the overlapping part of the circle is your passion, right? And that might be where you might have so much to give, but it will be costly to some degree as well. Now, we don't want to burn you out completely, so that needs to be taken care of. You need to be replenished as well, which is why, as I said, like, much earlier in our conversation, that living into the spirit of Sabbath, what is the reason we are doing all this work for? And then there's like an added dimension to that as well, that where you have to say, you know what? The world is more than my efforts. If I'm going to believe that the world is the sum of my efforts, then that's just going to drive me into the ground because there was always more to do and I need to be able to do it. And so basically, I need to. And how are you not going to burn out if that's the recipe that you're going with? But if there's
Yeah.
ways of sort of working out, okay, here's my passion, but also here's where I might be tipping over into
Mm.
burnout territory. I think that is how we are meant to live in that constant kind of conversation back and forth. How is this going? Do I need to sort of shift things
Yeah.
around in order to keep things in hand?
And in the intro to this podcast, I'll obviously talk about your work at CPX, which is the Center for Public Christianity, and your role there. And you talked a little bit about the Sabbath. What does that mean to you? And what can people that aren't approaching this from a faith background learn from, I guess, the notion of a Sabbath? What does it mean?
Yeah.
Can we build that more into our life? Does it have to be a day? Because I don't have 10 minutes.
No, and
How do we?
this is the thing. We are in bondage, and I use that slavery metaphor quite
Yeah.
like deliberately. We're in bondage to, well, really a capitalist society that makes our contribution the same as our worth, right? And so if that puts us on the achievement addiction path, then you'll never stop working. And in some ways, the system that we're now in, the exorbitant cost of housing in Australia means that you really can't deviate that much from that path if you want to live in a certain place like Sydney. But really, I think Sabbath at heart is a social vision, right? It's a way of saying that everyone should be able to not work to within an inch of their lives. They shouldn't be forced to scramble and to work second jobs so they can just have a basic, way to live, a basic income to live. And so Sabbath, like, I mean, in the religious vision, I suppose it's a time to be able to celebrate what life is all about, and hopefully for people of faith, that means meeting with other people of faith and talking about God and all those wonderful things and community and love and flourishing and all that sort of stuff. Hopefully that's part of it. But, for people who aren't coming from that perspective, it's about just celebrating the goodness of life. And everyone can point to something that they're deeply grateful for, whether that's other people, whether that's the natural environment, or even just like that idea of, as I said before, in that dinner party conversation where there's that hushed silence that falls over people and everyone's like, oh, isn't this wonderful? That's the spirit of
Beautiful.
Sabbath, giving people the opportunity to be able to live into that and exist, even, as part of a rhythm of days, once in a span of 7 days is the Christian pattern. But that, which is good, right? Because it does have a big it does mean that work has, and fulfilling work as well, has a big part to play in our lives, but it's not the entirety of existence. And so if there's
Mm.
like a pattern that people can just pause momentarily from that work in order to enjoy life and celebrate the meaningfulness of life with other people, then I think that's really wonderful. I totally agree with you that I don't have my Sabbath. My Sunday is not really a Sabbath because I'm often having to do stuff as well. But my small movement towards that is to just not have to go to the shopping center on a Sunday.
Wow.
And like I don't think that even sounds that ambitious really, but it feels ambitious in this day
This
and age
this
because you
time
do
of
have to
year,
plan.
especially. Yeah.
No, that's right. You do have to plan your life so that you can do that. To just not go, I don't have to go to a shopping center on
Yeah.
Sunday. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And the strange thing is, Matthew, that like it wasn't that long ago where Sunday trading did not exist.
I remember
Sunday
when,
sport as well,
yeah,
right?
I grew up in England. I remember when shops were open, I think for 3 hours on a Saturday, and there's no online shopping. If you didn't have it, you didn't have it. Justine, I just finished reading or listening to, I don't know if I can say I've read it if it's an audiobook, but I've just finished listening to Stanley Tucci's What I Ate in a Year.
Oh, I
And
think
I
he's
am
wonderful. I haven't
at,
read that or heard that,
oh,
but
Stanley, if you're listening, come and have a chat. I am absolutely obsessed with him. Not only is he an incredibly stylish man in his mid 60s, but I am just obsessed with this notion that he talks about what I ate in a year, about slowing down and having meals,
Mm.
and the beauty and the craftsmanship and the wonder and the company and the all of that kind of stuff that he talks about is really lovely. And it's really, like I said, made me stop and think, okay, how can we begin to cultivate a little bit more of this slowness in our lives? And
Yeah. Well, I think that's Sabbath, right?
it's
It's
wonderful.
a
I
it's an
would
entry point
highly
into that.
recommend it if you haven't read the book. Justine, it's a really important time of year for our HSC students. I
Mm.
believe on the 18th of December, ATARs will be released. Do you have any thoughts on, bearing in mind your work, Achievement Addiction, do you have any thoughts on how HSC students can better handle this really difficult and really challenging time,
Yeah.
potentially challenging time?
I really feel the pain of any young person who feels that a lot is riding on this number, right? This ranking
Mm,
that they'll get given. But at the same time, I would just really say this is just one number. You haven't spent it feels as though you've spent the entirety of your school career heading towards this one number. And it feels like this number is not just a measure of your speed and your skill on a particular day or on the days that you carried out these assessments, but it feels like it's peering into your soul and giving you a mark, right? And rating you in that sense. And it's a tool. Unfortunately, it does take on it feels like it takes on more existential weight because that's just the system that we've decided to put young people in for like 13 years of their life. But
yeah,
it's not their fault if they feel like that. That's just the constraints of the system, which might be a reason to sort of shift the parameters of the system. That's one thing. But in some ways, maybe that is already starting because I believe that there's more unis doing early entry, right, for students. And so there's not so much riding on that rating at the end of that ranking right at the end with the HSC in Sydney anyway. And also like the government has started to say that they're going to limit the numbers of international students that will be allowed
yeah.
to come to Australian universities. And honestly, that's how a lot of Australian universities pay their bills these days. So my what I'm trying to say is that universities basically are desperate. So they're desperate for you to go there. And even if you don't get the mark or the number that you needed to qualify for your desired degree, you could always transfer at the end of your first year somewhere. And I'm sure the universities will want
Mm,
to hear from you because they need you for their continued existence. So I would kind of want to I would want young people to feel more confident that they do have some power and agency here. It's really up to them where they want to take that.
yeah, I think it's really. I remember thinking, and this many, many years ago. I think it was the UAI when I did the HSC, and I remember thinking this is the most important mark in my entire life, and it wasn't. I didn't do particularly well, and back then there just weren't as many options that there are now for alternative
Mm,
pathways, and I think having a conversation about that is really important because it is one mark. It's important, but it's not. It's not who you are. It's not your identity.
no, that's right.
And
But I don't think we talk about that enough,
no,
right? So, which is
I
why I
don't.
think this book that I wrote, I
Yeah,
think it has something to contribute because it's
I
like, this
agree.
is how the world operates, right?
Yeah,
Weirdly. Why is that? And why don't we ever just pause and say, hang on, none of us love our nearest and dearest because of how good they are at their job or because of how clever they are at X, Y, or Z, right? That's not why we love them. That's a piece of them, but it's not the entirety of them. And
mm,
so I just wanted to just shine a light on that and say, let's talk about this because I felt like this. I'm sure other people are feeling like that too.
yeah. Justine, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for pouring your heart out in this latest book. I really couldn't put it down. It was a great read and it really made me change a few things in my life. So thank you for taking the time. And my hope is that there would be people all over the world that would listen to this conversation and get a copy of the book because it really is so needed in this day and age. So thank you for taking the time and also for giving up your weeknight to have a conversation with me. I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Matthew. It was a real delight to talk to you. So thank you.
Thank you.